The first time I saw him, he was nothing more than a boy with iron around his wrists, sitting in the shadow of a felt tent while the wind carved patterns in the dust around his feet. The chains were too heavy for his thin frame, and they had worn raw circles into his flesh where the metal bit deep with every movement. Blood had dried in dark crusts around the shackles, and flies gathered at the wounds like tiny vultures drawn to carrion. But his eyes held something that made even the guards step carefully around him, as if they sensed that beneath the surface of this broken child lay something that could devour the world. The scent of him was different too, something the horses recognized before the men did. They would shy away when he passed, nostrils flaring, ears pinned back against their skulls. The shamans said it was the smell of destiny, but I knew better. It was the scent of a soul being forged in fire, of innocence being burned away to reveal something harder and more terrible than any weapon ever crafted by human hands. Even the camp dogs would not approach him, though they begged scraps from every other captive. They sensed what we all sensed but dared not name, that this boy carried within him the seeds of an ending that would consume everything we knew. I was young then, perhaps 12 summers, serving as a messenger in the camp of the Taichud who had captured him. They called him Temujin, though some whispered older names that tasted of prophecy and blood when spoken aloud. The wind knew his true nature even then, carrying his scent across the steppes like a warning that few were wise enough to heed. The morning sky was the color of old bone when they brought him in, dragged behind a horse through grass still wet with dew and the tears of heaven. His father, they said, had been poisoned by enemies who smiled while they poured death into his cup. And this boy was all that remained of a bloodline that stretched back to the wolf mother herself. The Taichud chief, Targutai, looked upon the prisoner with the satisfaction of a hunter who has finally cornered the beast that has eluded him for seasons beyond counting. But even in chains, even with his shoulders bent under the weight of iron and humiliation, there was something in the way Temujin held his head that spoke of storms gathering beyond the horizon. His silence was not the quiet of defeat, but the stillness that comes before lightning strikes the earth and sets the world ablaze. The older warriors who had known his father would glance at him and then quickly look away, as if they feared that meeting his gaze might awaken something they were not prepared to face. They kept him like this for months, that felt like years. This boy who would one day make the earth tremble beneath the hooves of 10,000 horses. During the day, he was forced to tend the herds, his movements limited by the heavy wooden kang they had locked around his neck, a collar that marked him as less than human, less than the animals he was made to serve. At night, they chained him to a stake driven deep into the frozen ground, where he would sit motionless as stone, while the stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered secrets that only he seemed to understand. I watched him during those endless days, drawn by something I could not name. While other children played at being warriors, fighting mock battles with wooden swords and dreaming of glory, I found myself studying this silent figure who had become a living ghost in our midst. He never complained, never begged, never showed the slightest sign that his spirit had been broken by the weight of his captivity. Instead, he watched and learned and waited with the patience of winter itself. The guards spoke of him in hushed tones when they thought no one could hear. They told stories of how he would stare at the horizon for hours without blinking, as if he could see beyond the curve of the earth to places that existed only in legend. They whispered that sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, they could hear him speaking in a voice that was not quite his own, holding conversations with spirits that had no names and casting words into the darkness like seeds that would one day bloom into conquest and fire. If you think power is given, you've never seen what pain can create. There was a girl in the camp, perhaps 16 summers, who would sometimes bring him water when the guards were distracted by their gambling or their drink. Her name was Berta, and she moved with the grace of deer crossing a meadow at dawn. She was beautiful in the way that wild things are beautiful, untamed, fierce, with eyes that reflected the vast sky and hair that caught the wind like black silk. She never spoke to him directly, for such a thing would have brought punishment upon them both, but I saw the way her eyes lingered on his face, as if she could read there the story of what he had been and what he might yet become. I learned later that she had been promised to him in childhood, before his father's death had cast him down into the darkness of captivity. Their families had sealed the bond with sacred words and offerings to the sky, but those promises seemed as distant as stars now that he sat in chains while she walked free among the victors. Yet she remembered, and more than remembered, she believed. When other girls whispered that he was cursed, that touching him would bring misfortune, she would watch him with eyes that held no fear, only a patience that matched his own. She had her own pain. This daughter of warriors who had been forced to watch her betrothed reduced to something less than human. I saw her sometimes in the early morning, standing at the edge of camp and staring out at the endless grassland as if she could will him free through the sheer force of her longing. The other women said she was mad to remain faithful to a boy who might never again be worthy of her, but they did not understand what she understood, that beneath the dirt and blood and iron, something magnificent was taking shape. One evening, as the sun dyed red behind the mountains and the first stars appeared like wounds in the darkening sky, I crept close enough to hear their whispered conversation. Her voice was soft as falling snow, but her words carried the weight of prophecy. "The wolves are singing tonight. Do you hear them?" And he, still wrapped in his chains like a living mummy, replied in a voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well, "They sing of freedom and of the price that freedom demands. They sing of blood that has not yet been spilled and of empires that have not yet fallen." The escape came during the festival of the summer moon, when even the most vigilant guards allowed themselves to be seduced by fermented mare's milk and the temporary forgetfulness it promised. Temujin had been planning it for months, watching the patterns of the guards' movements, memorizing the location of every tent and every stake, calculating the precise moment when the stars would align to favor his flight. But it was more than calculation that guided him. It was something deeper, a voice that whispered to him in dreams and spoke of destinies that could not be chained. The guards had grown careless over the months, lulled into complacency by his apparent submission. They no longer watched him with the same intensity, no longer checked his bonds with the same thoroughness. To them, he had become part of the landscape, as fixed and harmless as the stones that marked the boundaries of their camp. They did not see the way he tested the iron links when he thought no one was looking, or how he had slowly, patiently, worked one of the pins loose over countless nights of patient manipulation. I was awakened that night, not by sound, but by silence, the sudden cessation of the whispered prayers and lamentations that had become his nightly ritual. In the moonlight that filtered through the smoke hole of our tent, I could see him working at his bonds with a piece of broken bone he had somehow concealed from his captors. The fragment was small, no larger than a finger, but he wielded it with the precision of a master craftsman, applying pressure in exactly the right places, at exactly the right angles. The cangue around his neck had been crafted by skilled artisans, held together by pins that were meant to last forever, designed to be a permanent reminder of his subjugation. But nothing crafted by human hands could contain the force that had been building within him through all those months of silent rage. Each night, working in darkness so complete that he had to navigate by touch alone, he had worn away at those pins with the patience of water wearing away stone. The work had taken its toll on him. His fingers were raw and bloody from the effort, his shoulders cramped from maintaining the same position hour after hour. But pain had become his teacher, his constant companion, his most faithful advisor. It had taught him that suffering was just another form of strength, that endurance was the foundation upon which all victories were built. When the wooden collar finally split apart, the sound was like thunder rolling across a clear sky. Yet somehow no one in the camp stirred. It was as if the very spirits had conspired to muffle the noise, to wrap his moment of liberation in supernatural silence. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, everything was perfectly still. The wind held its breath, the horses stopped their restless shifting. Even the insects fell silent, as if the entire world had paused to witness this moment of transformation. Then Temujin rose to his feet, and in that simple act, everything changed. He did not run immediately, as I had expected. Instead, he stood motionless in the moonlight, his freed hands hanging at his sides, his face turned toward the sky, as if he were receiving instructions from powers that dwelt beyond the reach of earthly understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the sleeping camp like a prayer and a curse combined. I was born to kneel to no man. The sky itself bears witness to this vow. His flight across the steppes that night was like the passage of a wolf through a flock of sleeping sheep, swift, silent, and devastating in its implications. By the time the guards discovered his absence, he had vanished into the darkness as completely as if the earth had opened to swallow him whole. The tracking dogs, when they were finally brought to his trail, whined and cowered and refused to follow the scent, as if they could smell something in his wake that their animal instincts warned them to avoid. But I knew where he had gone, for I had seen the direction of his gaze during those long months of captivity. He had gone to the sacred mountain where his ancestors had made their offerings to the eternal blue sky. The place where the spirits of wolves and eagles had first taught human beings the arts of war and survival. It was there, in that thin air where heaven and earth touched, that the boy who had been Temujin would die, and something else would be born from the ashes of his humiliation. The years that followed were marked by rumors and whispers, stories that drifted across the steppes like smoke from distant fires. Travelers spoke of a young warrior gathering followers in the wild places beyond the reach of civilized law, a figure who moved like shadow and struck like lightning, always appearing where he was least expected and vanishing before his enemies could organize a response. They called him by many names: the Wolf's Son, the Skyborn, the one who walks with spirits. But those who had known him before recognized the truth that lay beneath the growing legend. But the legend told only half the story. What the rumors did not capture was the systematic way he built his power, the careful cultivation of loyalty that went far beyond fear or greed. He sought out the broken, the discarded, the men whom fortune had cast aside as thoroughly as it had once cast him aside. These were not the elite warriors that other leaders competed to recruit. These were the scarred and bitter, the ones who had tasted defeat and found it had a flavor they would never forget. He made them into something new, something that had never existed before on the steppes. Where other Khans ruled through blood ties and ancient privileges, he created bonds forged in shared suffering and common purpose. He taught them that strength came not from individual prowess, but from unity, that 1,000 men moving as one could defeat 10,000 fighting as individuals. More importantly, he taught them to see beyond the immediate battle to the war that lay beyond, to understand that victory was not a moment, but a way of being. In the valleys where winter winds cut like knives and summer heat baked the earth to hardness, he trained them not just in the arts of war, but in the disciplines of endurance. They learned to survive on handfuls of dried meat and fermented milk, to find water where none seemed to exist, to read the subtle signs that separated a safe path from a deadly one. They became as much at home in the saddle as on foot, able to shoot accurately while galloping at full speed, to communicate through signals that could be read across vast distances. But perhaps most importantly, he taught them loyalty, not the blind obedience that most leaders demanded, but something deeper and more lasting. He made each man feel that he was not merely a soldier in an army, but a vital part of something greater than himself. When one of them fell in battle, the others mourned not just a comrade, but a brother. When one achieved distinction, all shared in the glory. This was his greatest innovation, the weapon that would prove more devastating than any sword or bow, the transformation of individual warriors into a single organism driven by collective will. I saw him again during the winter, when the shamans said the world would end, when the cold was so fierce that birds fell frozen from the sky, and even the hardiest warriors huddled around their fires and spoke in whispers of the hunger that stalked the camps like an invisible predator. He came riding out of a blizzard that had been raging for 3 days, appearing at the edge of our camp so suddenly that the sentries thought he was a spirit sent by the winter itself. But he was no spirit. He was something far more dangerous. The boy I remembered had been lean to the point of starvation, all sharp angles and desperate eyes. This man, who sat his horse with the stillness of carved stone, was something else entirely. His frame had filled out with the muscle that comes from years of hard living and harder fighting, and his eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the vast emptiness of the sky itself. He wore no armor, carried no banner, bore no marks of rank or station. Yet when he spoke, even the wind seemed to quiet itself to listen. He had come for Berta, as everyone knew he would. The girl who had waited for him through all the seasons of his exile stood at the edge of the crowd, her face pale as winter moonlight, but her eyes burning with a fire that could have melted the ice from the rivers. When their gazes met across that space filled with armed men and unspoken threats, something passed between them that transcended words. A recognition, an affirmation, a promise that had survived years of separation and uncertainty. She walked to him through that hostile crowd as if she moved through an empty field, her head high, her steps sure and graceful. No one tried to stop her, though her kinsmen muttered and fingered their weapons. There was something in her bearing that made interference impossible, a dignity that commanded respect, even from those who had every reason to hate the man she approached. When she reached his side and placed her hand upon his leg as he sat his horse, I saw him change, not in any way that was visible to casual observation, but something fundamental shifted in his bearing. The terrible loneliness that had marked him since childhood seemed to ease, as if her touch had reminded him of what he fought for beyond mere conquest and revenge. She was not just a woman to him. She was the living embodiment of everything he had lost and everything he meant to reclaim. "I have come for what is mine," he said. And though his voice was no louder than ordinary conversation, every person in the camp heard his words as clearly as if he had shouted them from the top of the sacred mountain. "I have come for the warriors who remember what it means to serve something greater than themselves. I have come for those who are tired of kneeling to men who have forgotten that power is earned, not inherited." The effect of his words was immediate and electric. Warriors who had served the Taitsud for decades found themselves stepping forward, drawn by something in his voice that spoke to the deepest parts of their souls. These were not weak men or cowards. They were seasoned fighters who had carved their reputations from the bones of their enemies. Yet they knelt before this young man as if he were the embodiment of everything they had ever dreamed of becoming. Targutai himself emerged from his tent, wrapped in furs and flanked by his most trusted bodyguards, his face twisted with a rage that had been building since the night his prize prisoner had vanished into the darkness. "You dare show your face here, boy? You dare come before me with your handful of outcasts and broken men?" Temujin's response was not words, but laughter, deep, rich sound that seemed to rise from somewhere beyond the boundaries of ordinary human emotion. "I am no longer the boy you chained like a dog. I am no longer the frightened child who begged the sky for mercy. I have become something that your small mind cannot comprehend, something that your petty kingdom cannot contain. The challenge that followed was not a formal duel, but something more primal, more fundamental, a contest between the old ways and something new that was struggling to be born. Targutai fought with all the skill and experience that had made him feared across the steppes, wielding his curved sword like an extension of his own will. But Temujin moved like water, like wind, like the very force of destiny itself made manifest in human form. When it was over, when Targutai lay still in the snow with his blood steaming in the cold air, Temujin stood over his fallen enemy and spoke words that would be remembered long after the last star had burned out in the endless night. This is what becomes of those who mistake cruelty for strength. This is the fate that awaits all who believe that chains can hold what the sky has made free. The warriors who had gathered to watch this confrontation knelt in the blood-soaked snow, and in their submission, I saw the birth of something that would reshape the world. This was not merely the victory of one man over another. This was the moment when the scattered tribes of the steppes began to recognize their true master, the Wolf Lord, who would unite them under a single banner and lead them to conquests beyond their wildest dreams. But even as I witnessed this triumph, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. The boy I had known, the silent prisoner who had sat in chains and watched the world with patient eyes, was truly gone. In his place stood something that wore his face, but had been transformed by pain and rage and an iron will into something that was more and less than human. The chains had been broken, but they had left marks on his soul that would never heal. Scars that would drive him to impose his will upon the world until every living thing knelt before him as he had once been forced to kneel. The years that followed blurred together like images seen through smoke and flame. I watched as his following grew from a handful of outcast warriors to a vast horde that moved across the steppes like a living storm. I saw him take wives from the tribes he conquered, not from desire, but from the cold calculation of a mind that understood how bloodlines could be woven together to create unbreakable bonds of loyalty. I witnessed the birth of his sons, each one marked from the moment of their first breath with the weight of their father's terrible destiny. But it was in these early campaigns that his true genius revealed itself, not merely as a warrior, but as something far more dangerous, a student of human nature who understood that the greatest victories were won in the hearts and minds of men before the first arrow was ever loosed. His enemies expected him to fight as steppe warriors had always fought, with individual courage and spontaneous fury. Instead, he gave them something they had never encountered: discipline married to innovation, tradition wedded to ruthless pragmatism. He revolutionized the very concept of warfare on the grasslands, where other leaders divided their forces along tribal lines, maintaining the ancient feuds and rivalries that had kept the nomads weak and scattered for generations. He created units based on skill and merit alone. A man's worth was measured not by his bloodline, but by his effectiveness, not by his family's history, but by his personal loyalty to the cause that had become larger than any individual tribe. His tactical innovations were equally revolutionary. He understood that mobility was the steppes' greatest gift, but he combined it with discipline in ways that multiplied its effectiveness beyond anything previously imagined. His warriors could execute complex maneuvers at full gallop, could coordinate attacks across vast distances, could appear to retreat, only to wheel around and strike at their pursuers' flanks with devastating precision. More importantly, he understood the power of fear as a weapon. Not the mindless terror that came from random brutality, but calculated psychological warfare that made surrender seem preferable to resistance. Cities that submitted were treated with relative mercy. Those that resisted were destroyed so completely that neighboring settlements would capitulate at the mere mention of his name. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but strategy refined to its purest essence, the conservation of his own forces' strength through the efficient application of his enemy's weaknesses. Yet for all his tactical brilliance, what truly set him apart was his ability to inspire absolute devotion in men who had every reason to abandon him. The warriors who followed him into battle knew that he shared their dangers, that he ate the same food they ate, slept on the same ground they slept on, endured the same hardships they endured. When he led them into battle, he rode at the front of the charge, not safely in the rear, where conventional wisdom said a leader belonged. The old shamans spoke of prophecies in those days, visions of a great king who would arise from the steppes to unite all peoples under the eternal blue sky. But they had expected a hero from the ancient stories, a noble warrior blessed by the spirits and guided by wisdom. What they got instead was something far more complex and dangerous, a man who had been broken and remade into an instrument of conquest, whose every action was driven by memories of humiliation that burned in his mind like coals that could never be extinguished. I remember the night before his greatest victory, when his army stretched across the horizon like a sea of steel and leather and burning eyes. He sat alone by a fire that cast shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own, staring into the flames as if he could read there the story of everything that had led to this moment. When I approached him, drawn by some impulse I could not name, he spoke without looking up. "Do you remember the boy who sat in chains while his enemies laughed at his weakness?" "I remember," I replied, though my voice was barely a whisper in the vastness of the night. "That boy is dead," he said, and in his words I heard echoes of grief that would never find comfort. "He died the night I broke free from their bonds, and something else was born from his ashes. Something that understands that mercy is a luxury that only the strong can afford, and that the strong are those who have learned to transform their pain into power." And the battle that followed was not merely a military engagement, but a work of art, painted in blood and terror. His enemies came against him with confidence, born of superior numbers and better equipment. But they had not reckoned with the force that pain can become when it is properly focused and directed. His warriors moved like extensions of his own will, striking where their enemies were weakest, vanishing when resistance grew too strong, always reforming and attacking again with a persistence that wore down even the bravest defenders. When the sun set that day, it illuminated a field where 10,000 men lay still in the gathering darkness, and standing among them was the man who had once been a chained boy in a Taichud tent. His victory was absolute, total, devastating in its completeness. Yet as I looked upon his face in that moment of ultimate triumph, I saw not joy, but something closer to emptiness, as if the very achievement of his revenge had robbed him of the purpose that had sustained him through all the dark years of preparation. Power did not change him. It revealed what pain had built. The empire he forged in the years that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A vast organism that stretched from sea to sea and consumed everything in its path. Cities fell before him like wheat before the scythe, their walls crumbling beneath the weight of his relentless advance. Kings and emperors who had ruled for generations found themselves kneeling in the dust of their own throne rooms, begging for mercy from a man who had learned too well what it meant to be powerless. But for all his conquests, for all the treasure that flowed into his hands like water from a broken dam, I could see that he remained fundamentally unchanged from the boy who had sat in chains and dreamed of freedom. The empire was not an end, but a means, not a destination, but a journey towards something that he could never quite articulate, but could never stop pursuing. He built his kingdom from the broken bones of his enemies, but he built it as a monument to a pain that no amount of victory could heal. I grew old in his service, my hair turning white as winter snow, while his remained black as the depths of a moonless night. I watched his sons grow to manhood and begin to eye his throne with the hunger that had once driven their father. I saw the cracks beginning to appear in the foundation of his great work, the subtle signs that even the mightiest empire is only as strong as the will that holds it together. His sons were both his greatest achievement and his deepest sorrow. Yochi, the eldest, carried within him a fury that echoed his father's, but lacked the discipline that had made that fury effective. Chagatai possessed intelligence and cunning, but was consumed by bitterness over being passed over for succession. Ogadai had the wisdom to rule, but perhaps not the strength to hold together what his father had built through will and terror. Tolui, the youngest, combined his father's military genius with a mystical bent that worried even the shamans. I was present during many of the conversations between father and sons, and what struck me most was not what was said, but what remained unspoken. He tried to teach them the lessons that pain had taught him, but how could they truly understand? They had been born to privilege, raised in luxury, surrounded by the certainty of their own importance. They knew of their father's humble origins, but it was knowledge, not experience. They had never felt chains bite into their flesh, never known the helplessness that comes from being utterly at another's mercy. More troubling still was what I saw in his own eyes when he looked upon them. Love, certainly, but also a kind of desperate sadness, as if he already knew that they would squander the legacy he had built for them. They fought among themselves even while he lived, each believing that he alone truly understood their father's vision, none recognizing that the vision itself was born from a pain they had never shared and could never truly comprehend. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between campaigns, I would find him staring out at the vast encampments that surrounded whatever palace or fortress currently served as his capital. Tens of thousands of warriors owed him absolute allegiance. Millions of subjects across dozens of conquered kingdoms called him master. Yet I could see in his face a loneliness that all the conquest in the world could never fill. He had become something beyond human understanding, a force of nature as impersonal as the wind or the rain, and that transformation had cost him the simple human connections that might have brought him peace. His relationship with Berta remained the one constant in his life, the one source of genuine warmth in an existence that had become increasingly cold and calculating. She alone could still see the boy who had sat in chains rather than only the emperor who commanded nations. When they were together, some of the terrible isolation that surrounded him seemed to lift, as if her presence reminded him of who he had been before the world remade him into an instrument of its own subjugation. Near the end, when the weight of years had begun to settle upon his shoulders like snow upon the mountains, I found him standing alone on a hillside overlooking the vast camp where his army slept beneath the stars. The wind that had whispered to him as a boy still sang in his ears, but now its song was different, sadder, more complex, tinged with the knowledge of endings that even the greatest of men cannot avoid. "Tell me," he said without turning to look at me, "what do you see when you look upon all that I have built?" I was silent for a long moment, searching for words that could capture the magnitude of what lay spread before us. Finally, I spoke the truth that had been growing in my heart for decades. I see the dream of a boy in chains, made manifest through will and blood and an iron determination to never kneel again. He nodded slowly, as if my words had confirmed something he had long suspected. "And when I am gone? When the wind has scattered my ashes and the earth has claimed my bones, what will remain of the boy who swore to the sky that he would never bow to any man?" "His name," I replied, "his name will remain, carved into the memory of the world like words cut into stone." It will be spoken with fear and reverence long after the last star has burned out in the endless night. The smile that crossed his face was unlike any expression I had ever seen him wear. Peaceful, almost gentle, touched with a sadness that went deeper than oceans. Then perhaps it was all worthwhile. Perhaps the price I paid, the price the world paid, was not too dear for such immortality. He died as quietly as he had lived those first years of his captivity, passing from the world like shadow fleeing before the dawn. There were no great ceremonies, no monuments raised to mark his passing. According to his wishes, his body was placed upon a simple cart and driven into the wilderness, where it was buried in a place known only to the wind and the wolves, who had always been his truest companions. I was one of the few permitted to accompany that final journey, riding beside the cart that bore the remains of the man who had remade the world through the force of his will. The procession moved in absolute silence through landscapes that bore the scars of his passage, burned cities reduced to ash, rivers that ran red with the memory of blood, valleys where the grass had never quite recovered from the weight of his army's hooves. As we traveled deeper into the wilderness, away from the roads and settlements where his name was spoken, with equal measures of fear and reverence, I felt the weight of history settling around us like a shroud. This was how empires truly ended, not with great battles or dramatic pronouncements, but with the quiet return of mortal flesh to the earth that had birthed it. Yet even in death, he remained somehow larger than life, as if his spirit had expanded to fill the very air around us. The burial site itself was unremarkable. A hillside overlooking a valley where wildflowers grew in profusion, where streams ran clear and cold down from the mountains. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a place that might have reminded him of the steps of his youth before pain and ambition had transformed him into something beyond ordinary human understanding. There, without ceremony or monument, we committed his body to the earth and rode away, leaving no marker that might betray the location to future generations. But death, I came to understand over the years that followed, was not an ending for such a man, but merely another transformation. His empire might fragment and his armies might scatter, but the force he had become transcended the boundaries of flesh and blood. In the years that followed his passing, I saw his influence in the eyes of every conqueror who looked upon the world and dreamed of making it kneel. I heard his voice in the war cries of warriors who had never known his name, but carried his spirit like a virus in their blood. The boy who had sat in chains beneath the eternal blue sky had become something that could never be chained, something that would move through history like a ghost seeking new bodies to inhabit. His pain had been transformed into a legacy that would outlast mountains. His humiliation refined into a power that would reshape the very concept of what it meant to rule. Kings and emperors in distant lands would study his tactics, would seek to emulate his methods, would dream of building empires that might rival his own. But they would never understand the true source of his power, for they had never sat in chains and felt the weight of iron around their wrists. They had never known the particular alchemy that transforms absolute powerlessness into absolute determination, had never experienced the moment when survival itself becomes a form of victory. They saw only the conquests, the tactical innovations, the political structures he had created. They could not see the broken boy who remained at the heart of it all, forever working in the darkness to break the bonds that held him captive. I am old now, older than the hills that remember the first footsteps of human beings upon this ancient earth. My bones ache with the weight of too many memories, and my eyes grow dim with the approach of that final darkness that comes to claim all mortal things. Soon I will join him in whatever realm awaits those who have witnessed the birth of legends and lived to tell the tale. But before I go, before I surrender my breath to the wind that has carried his name across the centuries, I must speak the truth that has burned in my heart since the night he broke his chains and strode into immortality. He was not the monster that his enemies claimed him to be, nor was he the god that his followers believed him to have become. He was something far more complex and tragic, a boy who had been broken by the cruelty of the world and had spent his life ensuring that no one would ever break him again. The chains that bound his body had been forged from iron, but the chains that bound his spirit were made from pain and shame and a rage that could never be satisfied. In breaking free from one, he had become a slave to the other, doomed to spend eternity seeking a peace that could only come through the complete submission of everything that might threaten his newfound freedom. He rose from chains, and the world has never stopped kneeling since. The wind carries his story across the steppes where it all began, and in that wind, those who listen carefully might still hear the echo of iron against wood, the sound of a boy working through the night to break the bonds that held him captive. But they might also hear something else, the whisper of a voice that learned too late that some prisons cannot be broken, only transformed into larger cages that encompass the entire world. Remember his name. It was born in pain, and it still commands the earth. And in the silence that follows, in the vast emptiness where legends go to die and be reborn, his shadow moves still, seeking new hearts to conquer and new souls to claim. For power such as his cannot be destroyed, it can only be passed on, waiting for the next broken boy or girl who will look upon the world with eyes that have seen too much and swear to the sky that they will never kneel again. The wind knows, the wind remembers, and the wind whispers still.